On the night of March 3rd, 2017, identical twin sisters Jean Haley and Martha Williams left their home in Barrington, Rhode Island with plans for nothing more than a quiet evening out with family. The two women were 97 years old, only 2 months shy of their 98th birthday, and despite their age, they were known for being active, independent, and close with their siblings. But what they didn't know was that the few simple steps from their car to their front door would turn into a situation neither of them could escape from. To understand everything that happened, you have to begin earlier on that evening. Jean and Martha had gone out to dinner with their younger sister, who was 89 at the time. The three of them had a habit of meeting up, eating together, and spending time just as they had done throughout their lives. Now, there was nothing unusual about this specific night. They didn't drink and they weren't out too late. This was just a normal family outing. After dinner, the three sisters returned to Jean's home on Opeechee Drive in Barrington. The time was somewhere between 8 and 8:30 p.m., confirmed later by investigators. Now, Jean was the one who drove the car that night. Even at 97, she was still licensed, still capable, and still comfortable behind the wheel. Martha, on the other hand, relied on a walker for support. The two had always balanced each other out. Jean was more mobile, while Martha was more careful, but both were still mentally sharp and physically capable, at least for their ages. When they pulled into the driveway, the younger sister, who had followed them home in her own vehicle, said goodbye and left, as she had no reason to worry or stay longer as the twins lived together, supported each other, and handled their nightly routine without issue. As far as anyone knew, the night was perfectly normal, but what no one saw was the exact conditions outside. According to the National Weather Service, temperatures in Barrington had already started dropping from the low 20s into the teens by the time the sisters had gotten home, and the wind was blowing at 10 to 15 miles per hour, which accelerates heat loss dramatically. Over the previous days, a mix of melting snow and light freezing rain had left many residential driveways in the area coated in thin, transparent ice, kinda like the type that reflects no light and blends completely into pavement. And in neighborhoods like theirs, where homes are spaced apart and street lighting doesn't directly hit private driveways, these patches become extremely difficult to detect even for much younger adults, let alone someone of their age. I want you to keep that in mind, by the way. But after the younger sister drove away, Jean and Martha began making their way from the driveway toward the house. Martha moved slowly with her walker, focusing on steady steps across the pavement, while Jean walked a bit behind her. The cold was already severe, and as I stated before, weather records showed that temperatures would continue dropping throughout the night, eventually reaching 11 degrees by early morning. Now, the turning point came only seconds after they stepped away from the car. At some point during their walk toward the front door, Martha slipped. Investigators later concluded she likely stepped on a patch of black ice, lost her footing, and fell backward. Because the ice offered no traction, her walker remained standing upright beside her, something police noted later because it indicated she didn't get knocked over or lose her balance in any uncontrolled way. She simply just slipped backward and landed on the driveway. Now, given her age and her reliance on the walker, getting back up on her own would have been nearly impossible. Jean saw her sister fall and did what anyone would do. She moved quickly toward her to help, but the pavement, as I said, was covered in the same invisible ice, so as she approached Martha, she would also slip. Her fall carried her toward the garage area of the home, where she landed close to the garage door, and just like Martha, she was unable to stand back up. And this is where the horrific part of the story begins. The part most people don't think about when they hear hypothermia. When someone lies on frozen pavement, the ground pulls body heat away up to 25 times faster than cold air. So the moment their clothing made contact with the ice, heat began draining out of their bodies at a rate their age simply couldn't withstand. So within minutes, their skin would have started to burn with cold, like deep aches that cut into the bones and make every attempt to move feel heavy and slow. As their core temperatures slipped below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, their muscles would have started to fail. Hypothermia isn't just cold, it shuts down the body from the inside. Their hands would have stiffened to the point where fingers barely responded. Their legs, already weakened from the fall, would have refused to cooperate. Every attempt to push up from the ice would have felt like trying to lift their own body weight through wet cement. Now, as hypothermia deepens, shivering becomes more violent, then stops completely. Not because the person is warm, but because the body no longer has enough energy to shake. Confusion sets in, thinking clearly becomes almost impossible. People start making slow, uncoordinated movements, sometimes barely lifting their arms or trying to crawl inches at a time. That confusion would have hit them slowly and silently as the night went on. Even their ability to yell for help would have collapsed. In freezing air, the vocal cords thicken and stiffen. Breathing turns shallow, and speech becomes quiet without the person even realizing it. Now add in the residential layout, spaced out homes, windows shut tight against the freezing temperatures, and cul-de-sacs with almost no nighttime traffic, and the odds of anyone hearing them become nearly zero. The wind only makes everything even worse. Gusts blowing across the driveway would have stripped more heat from their exposed skin. Frostbite doesn't take long at those temperatures, and the first signs, numbness and waxy skin, would have crept in silently. Their cheeks, hands, and ears would have gotten numb first, followed by a spreading cold that felt like it was sinking deeper into their bodies. Now, the detail I'm about to share with you is actually incredibly sad. Investigators later mentioned that Jean's body position suggested she tried to move toward the garage door, so she was close enough to reach safety, just a few more inches of movement. But like I said before, the ice offered no traction. Her clothing was frozen against the pavement, her muscles weakened, her coordination gone, and her ability to pull herself forward slipped away as her body temperature dropped. Martha's situation was just as grim. The walker still upright beside her meant she likely tried to grab it to pull herself up, but with no grip strength, stiff fingers, and no friction on the ice, she had no leverage. So every attempt she made only drained more of the little energy her body still had. As the hours passed, the scene around them turned even harsher. Frost formed across the driveway, their clothes stiffened even more, and their breathing slowed more and more. Eventually, as their core temperatures fell toward the low 80s, unconsciousness became inevitable. Now this is the final stage, the quiet stage, where victims stop moving, stop shivering, and simply slip deeper into the cold until the heart can't keep pumping. By the time dawn approached, the twins had been lying outside for nearly 12 hours. At around 8 a.m. on March 4th, a neighbor leaving for the day looked over and noticed two shapes lying motionless in the driveway. Getting closer and realizing what they were looking at, that neighbor immediately called 911. When first responders arrived, they found Jean near the garage door and Martha near her walker. EMS confirmed there was no signs of trauma beyond the fall and the effects of the cold exposure. The Rhode Island medical examiner determined the cause of death was severe hypothermia. Police found no signs of foul play, no forced entry, and no suspicious activity. Only the frozen driveway that had turned two simple steps into a fatal situation. Jean and Martha lived 97 years side by side. They were born together, they stayed together, and by tragic circumstances, died together. Their final night wasn't reckless or dramatic. It was a silent, unforgiving freeze on black ice. The kind of accident that happens in seconds but becomes impossible to escape even when safety is only a few feet away. Christine Marie Rollins, at 59 years old, worked as a private caretaker for an elderly woman in Chambers County, Texas. Her days began early, often long before sunrise, because a woman she cared for needed help getting ready each morning. She lived in Liberty County, about half an hour away from the home where she worked. Now, that part of Texas is filled with long stretches of rural land, two-lane roads, open fields, and scattered houses separated by wide spaces, and the property where she worked was no different. It sat off Cove Road near Anahook, with a main house, a separate small building on the property, a long driveway, and plenty of natural landscapes surrounding it. Now, people familiar with that area know that it's normal to see wildlife passing through open yards or moving near tree lines. It isn't city living, it's quiet, spacious, and rural. Christine had been employed by the family for close to a year. She helped the elderly woman with morning tasks, like preparing food, helping her get dressed, checking medication, and making sure the home was set up for the day. These were the things she had done in caregiving roles for years, and she was trusted to handle them without supervision. Her employers described her as reliable, her friends described her as dependable, and people close to her said she rarely missed work unless something unavoidable came up. And even then, she communicated clearly. Now, on the evening of November 23rd, 2019, nothing about her behavior stood out. She spent time with her friends earlier in the evening, spoke with her boyfriend later on, and went about her night as she normally would before an early shift. so she didn't mention feeling sick, she didn't report anything unusual, and her conversations were the same as every night before work. The next morning, she woke up at her usual time. It was still dark outside. She gathered the items she normally took with her and then walked outside to her car. She then started to drive from Liberty County to Chambers County. Now at that hour meant traveling roads with almost no traffic, so she would get there fast. Christine reached the property shortly before 6 a.m., which matched her usual arrival time. She stepped out, grabbed her things, and began walking toward the house. The path from her car to the front door was short and simple. She did it every shift. The porch light offered a faint glow around the entrance, but the yard itself remained dark. This you need to keep in mind. Now, inside the home, the elderly woman Christine cared for was still asleep. She expected Christine to come in soon, just like every other morning. The woman couldn't move around easily, so Christine's arrival was an important part of her daily stability. Usually Christine would enter quietly, but she always came in around the same time. But on this morning, that familiar routine did not happen. After enough time passed without hearing Christine come inside, the elderly woman began to feel uneasy. She couldn't just go outside and check, but she knew something wasn't right. Her husband lived in the small building across the driveway. I don't know why, but according to what I found, he just did. And sometime around 6:45, he stepped outside to walk over to the main house. Now this was a normal part of his routine, but as he approached the house, he noticed something on the ground near the entryway. At first, he couldn't tell what it was, but when he walked closer, he realized it was Christine. She was lying on the ground only a few steps from the front door. Seeing this, he immediately called 911. The deputies with the Chambers County Sheriff's Office and emergency medical personnel arrived quickly. Christine was unresponsive, and paramedics confirmed she had died before they reached her. Because the circumstances weren't immediately clear, deputies examined the area closely. The injuries present on her body were not typical of a fall or medical collapse. They documented the scene carefully, photographed the area, and treated it as a case requiring forensic review. Her body was taken to the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences, where full examination was done. Medical examiners looked at the wounds, the distribution of injuries, and the condition of the surrounding environment. They compared her injuries to known patterns of trauma and ruled out possibilities one by one. There was no signs of assault by another person, there was no indication of medical collapse causing the injuries, there was no vehicle strikes or evidence of any sharp weapons, at least from humans. Now, what the examination did show was absolutely brutal. Christine had sustained multiple puncture wounds, deep tearing injuries, and extensive trauma consistent with being attacked by a group of feral hogs. The wounds were not clear or uniform, they were ragged, uneven, and spread across her body, which is what happens when several hogs rush, ram, bite, and hook a victim simultaneously. Now, feral hogs don't attack like dogs or cats. They use their speed, weight, and tusks as weapons. A mature hog can weigh 200 to 300 pounds and can run up to 30 miles per hour, which is faster than even Usain Bolt. When they charge, they slam into a person's legs to knock them down, then attack the torso, arms, and face. Their lower tusks are sharp, curved upward, and designed to tear, not puncture cleanly. The medical examiner confirmed that Christine's injuries included tusk/lacerations, multiple penetrating wounds from repeated charges, severe tearing damage to soft tissue, and extensive bleeding from numerous blood vessels opened during the attack. She died from exsanguination, meaning she bled out from the sheer number of openings in her body. And because it was still dark outside, she would have had almost no warning until the hogs were already on her. Once that conclusion was reached, investigators returned to the property to examine the ground more closely. They documented multiple sets of hog tracks around the area where Christine's body had been found. The ground showed signs of disturbance consistent with a rapid animal movement. The soil was soft from recent rain, making tracks and drag marks more visible. Now, just like the last story, Christine had almost made it inside. The attack happened just a few feet from the front door, but like I said, just like the last story, unfortunately she didn't make it inside. She just wasn't fast enough. Based on the evidence, investigators concluded that Christine had stepped out of her vehicle and was walking toward the house when she encountered the hogs. In poor lighting with dark terrain and low visibility, she likely did not see them until they were already close. The attack would have been fast, chaotic, and overwhelming, and with the homeowners inside asleep, the struggle went unheard. Now, the deputies tried to find the hogs, but they could not identify or isolate the specific hogs involved. as feral hogs travel in groups, roam large territories, and don't stay put after an attack. Her death was ruled a feral hog attack, one of the rarest but most violent wildlife-related fatalities in the United States. Stephen Dyerke showed up for a shift on June 2nd, 2022 at the Caterpillar Foundry in Mapleton, Illinois, and nothing about that morning stood out as unusual, because this was a place where people dealt with heat, noise, and heavy steel every single day, and the routines were set in stone that workers often joked the building itself could run the first few hours of the shift without anyone in it. This was a massive facility where iron was melted down and poured into molds to create parts for the enormous machines Caterpillar builds. And everything in that environment ran off a rhythm which came from years of doing the same process over and over again. The part of the plant Stephen worked in was the melting and casting area, which is already one of the most dangerous areas in any foundry, because you're dealing with iron heated to temperatures that most people would back away from, even if they were 5 or 6 feet away from it. You've got these giant furnaces, recessed pits, elevated walkways, steel platforms, and open areas where molten metal sits glowing orange for hours. Now, Stephen wasn't an old employee who had been there for decades. According to OSHA documents and local reporting, he had only been at the foundry for about a week. And at a facility with this level of danger, 1 week is barely enough time to learn where everything is, let alone how everything works. Normally, new hires get a walkthrough, hands-on safety examples, and shadowing from experienced workers. But several employees later told investigators that the place was understaffed, and the training wasn't always as thorough as it needed to be, especially for a job involving molten metal. A few workers even went as far as to say they felt new employees were rushed into areas that weren't ready for because production deadlines were tight, and the company wanted people on the floor as fast as possible. Now, the shift had been moving normally that morning, with people checking equipment, prepping material, and dealing with the usual heat that comes from having massive furnaces running non-stop. It was so damn hot, even areas far from the melt floor were hot, and the protective gear workers wore wasn't optional. It was the only thing between them and temperatures that could cause burns without even touching anything. The layout of the building involved platforms built around pits, stairways, graded metal flooring, and railings that were supposed to keep people away from the most dangerous edges. But this would not happen. Now, according to OSHA and the timeline investigators reconstructed, Stephen was assigned to work near one of the large crucibles, which are these huge containers that hold molten iron. These crucibles sit inside sunken pits with platforms wrapping around them so workers can check temperatures and monitor the melt. Now, it was discovered that some of these platforms didn't have proper guardrails or mid-rails even in spots where they were required, and OSHA later confirmed this was true. In fact, there had been concerns raised before Stephen was ever even hired, but they hadn't been corrected. Now, sometime in the late morning, surveillance footage and witness statements showed Stephen working near one of those elevated platforms. He had tools with him for checking the material and moving through the normal prep process. Now, investigators couldn't map out every single second because factories like this have constant movement, noise, and visual obstructions, but they narrowed down that Stephen took a step toward a section of the platform that didn't have the barrier it was supposed to have. Workers nearby said they heard a quick metallic sound, like something shifting under weight, and when they turned, they saw Stephen slip forward. Like I said, there was no railing and no mid-railing, so there was nothing to stop him, and before anyone could reach him, he fell straight into the crucible. The temperature of the molten iron was over 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt through steel, and the exposure was so severe that several workers backed away from the radiant heat alone. People who ran toward the platform said the air itself felt like it was hitting them in waves, and they couldn't get within arm's reach because even the briefest contact with that temperature would cause catastrophic injury. The fall happened so fast there was nothing anyone could physically do. After this, supervisors immediately called emergency services, and Caterpillar locked down that area while they waited for the Tazewell County Sheriff's Office and first responders to arrive. When deputies and the coroner got there, they had to wait for the temperature to drop enough to safely approach. And the shutdown process wasn't quick, because you don't just shut off molten iron. Foundry workers had to assist law enforcement and the coroner because the environment was just too dangerous for responders to step in alone. By the time the area cooled, the coroner, Charles Hanley, confirmed that Stephen's death was caused by exposure involving molten metal and traumatic injuries consistent with the conditions in that area. There was no foul play suspected, and the incident was ruled a workplace accident. After this, OSHA began its investigation right away, demanding training records, logs, safety documents, maps of the production floor, and interviews from everyone who had been working there that day. Over the next several months, OSHA uncovered a list of safety failures that had been there long before Stephen even arrived. They determined Caterpillar had failed to protect workers from fall hazards in an area where molten metal was present. The section of platform Stephen had been standing on did not have the required guardrail, and multiple workers confirmed this wasn't new. OSHA also found that employees were not properly trained to recognize hazards in these areas, especially new hires who had only been there for a few days. Because of these violations, OSHA issued over $145,000 in fines, including one labeled as willful, which is the kind of citation OSHA uses when an employer knew about a hazard and didn't fix it. After the investigation ended, Caterpillar updated training guidelines, added new guardrails and barriers, and revised parts of the platform layout. OSHA ordered several safeguards to be installed around the melt line area, and they followed up to confirm Caterpillar made the required changes, which they did.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.